everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Kelly Pollack. I'm the Associate Dean of Students in Social Sciences. I just want to say a couple words of welcome. As you all know by this point, hopefully, this is part of our Emerging Leaders Initiative, the Leadership Lab that we've been running. We're really thrilled to be able to put on events like this, and we hope that you're finding them really useful throughout the year. Big hand to Bart, who's been organizing all of these events, and without whom we would not be able to do all of this. So thank you, Bart. I just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of events that are upcoming. You can all look at the schedule. We have a few more events this year, but especially draw your attention to May 15th. We'll be having our 3rd annual Career Day. We're really excited about that. We've got some great alumni coming, so I hope you'll look at that. And then May 29th, we have our Student Research Conference. So students who've received funds from the division to support their research will be talking to us. Not sort of a formal conference, but more of a way for it to be accessible for everybody, regardless of your field. So I hope you'll come and see what your fellow students have been up to. We have a lot of really, really exciting research going on in the division. So that's all I wanted to say. If you have ideas and thoughts about how this whole series of events has been going, things you'd like to see to support graduate students, please feel free to contact me or Bart, and we would love to hear feedback. Thanks.
And welcome, everyone. As Kelly mentioned, my name is Bart van Wassenhoven. I'm the coordinator of the Emerging Leaders Initiative. I'm also a PhD candidate in the Classics Department, and I have published 1 article and a number of book reviews. So today we're going to talk about the topic of publishing, which I think, especially for early career scholars, is often a key to getting your research out, establishing a name for yourself, and also often getting a first job. So publishing your first article can be a challenge, as with most things you do for the first time. There's a couple of questions that regularly come up. First of all, I think how to decide what to publish and when to publish it. I think once that choice is made, the next question is often, okay, where am I going to publish it? What journal is a good fit? What journal is the most likely to accept my submission? Then after that comes a phase where you prepare what probably was originally a dissertation chapter or a coursework paper or a conference paper. So adapting that into an article form, something that looks like an article, has its own set of problems often, or challenges. And then finally, I think something that will be new for most people who publish their first article is doing revisions based on what 2 peer reviewers are saying. Sometimes they may agree on things, sometimes they may disagree, and that can be something that is tricky to navigate. So to help us navigate that process, we have 4 experts here today who are working in scholarly publishing and editing. So without further ado, I would like to ask them to introduce themselves, say a little bit about their experience with scholarly publishing, and then we can take some of these topics and answer your questions at the end. There should be about 20 to 30 minutes for Q&A at the end. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves.
Can I start? Okay. My name is Linda Smith-Breckheisen. I am one of the assistant directors for the writing program here at the university. The writing program here, you may or may not know about us. We work with a lot of graduate students every quarter for all of the disciplines. People often misidentify us as only helping students in the humanities. That is not true. We have a lot of people in the social sciences. I recognize a couple of you here. We have a flagship course, Academic and Professional Writing, and a lot of graduate students take that course at different parts of their academic career. If you take it as pass-fail, you can actually work on things like article submissions, documents you're already working on. This year, we've also partnered with Graduate Student Affairs to offer some new graduate writing resources. The most popular thus far has been the graduate writing consultants, which are one-on-one sessions where graduate students can make an appointment and work with a consultant on up to 10 pages of their prose at a time. We've seen a lot of people working on articles, and one of the different kinds of sessions you can have, one is where you can actually bring in articles from your field and analyze them with a consultant, and that's been particularly helpful for people who are trying to publish.
I'm Jan Goldstein. I'm a professor of European and especially French history here, and I'm here on the panel today in my capacity as one of the editors of the Journal of Modern History, which I've been for more than 15 years now. The Journal of Modern History, despite its rather capacious name, is really only a journal of European history from the Italian Renaissance until the present. So I have seen the journal article process from the point of view of author, from the point of view of editor, and also from the point of view of mentor of my own students whom I've advised about when to publish articles and where.
My name is Susan Allen, and I have for 26 years been the managing editor of the American Journal of Sociology. You can see there are no newsstand sales of our publication because the cover would never attract any interest. But it is a very strong draw for people in sociology and some sociology-like social science areas. My role that's pertinent to this panel is the supervision on behalf of the editors of AJS of a very robust peer review process. So we have double-blind peer review at AJS, and most articles that are reviewed are receiving 3 reviews. I also do a lot of work on the editorial side, so once things are accepted, I see some of the problems that people have in meeting formatting requirements and such, but that's nothing. It's getting the paper in, getting good reviews, and getting the paper accepted that I think really counts, because every journal has its own editorial process. So I'd be glad to answer any questions about peer review that you might have.
I'm John Brehm. I'm a professor in political science. And I'm not an editor, and I don't help people in the creative writing program. So I suppose my capacity here is as an advisor to many of you about the stages of the writing process and how you submit things, identify journals to send your work to, and how do you deal with the reviewers' comments as they come back, and how you reconcile them to inevitably submit it again to some other place, or perhaps even ideally to the very same place for a revision.
Thank you. Also, I think we could get started with the question of what to publish and when. I think everyone here has heard the catchphrase publish or perish. Right? There's a lot of pressure on academics to start publishing early and often. And I think a lot of people have questions about when they should start publishing and what should be their first publication. Should you publish a paper that you've worked on in coursework? Should you publish part of your dissertation while you're still working on it? So some people have questions about what is the right time to start publishing and what is the best thing to start publishing as your first article. And so,
Yeah, I'd say that there isn't any rule about that at all. I mean, you might write a spectacularly good course paper or seminar paper that just kind of gels, and then that would be a good thing to try to publish. If that doesn't happen, that's not a catastrophe either. I'd say that probably the way the job market looks today, you probably want to go on it with one publication, and that should probably come from your dissertation research, or perhaps from a portion of your dissertation research that isn't going into the dissertation proper. But I don't think there can be any sort of hard and fast rule about exactly what point you should begin to submit articles.
I would say that it's not publish or perish. I would say it's more on the form of publish, or really think about what your career ought to be, because it's probably not as a professor or an academic. I mean, our job is to promulgate knowledge, and there are only 2 ways to do it. We could do it in the classroom, and that will carry for some of us, and that may be the biggest source of rewards for many of us. But we're unlikely to become professors, frankly. For those of us who are hoping for an academic position, we are hoping to have our work circulated as written word, as it's to be read by people outside of our own immediate face-to-face communities, but by people that you've never met. And to have your work read, reviewed, criticized, and sent back to you, well, that's part of our process here. I would certainly say that you have to think very early about getting your work available and out, and ideally, as I think Jan has said, probably as part of what defines you as a scholar. What will define you as a scholar when you come out onto the market will be your dissertation. People will think of you as what is this person working on, and they will want to see evidence of this, tangible evidence of this in the packet of materials that you send out. And the ideal way to do that is to give people an encapsulated version of that they can immediately go to get a very good sense of what that looks like, and that's going to be an article.
I should add to that it's not, I mean, I agree completely that one needs to publish, but the publication process is not entirely grim. I mean, it's really a very gratifying aspect of your work, assuming that the article that you send in gets sent out for outside readers. I mean, there is something very gratifying about seeing your own work reflected through the eyes of anonymous people that you don't know, and you learn a great deal from it, often if the reports are good, which they are not always. I mean, by good, I don't mean positive for you, but I mean good in the sense of taking your argument seriously and really trying to help you improve it. So I think it's one of the glories, in a way, of American publishing that we take peer review much more seriously than some other countries do, and that you shouldn't think of it as just a kind of gatekeeping operation. It's, you know, people do it without being paid, and they do it in a way because they care about the way professional knowledge is developing. So, so it's a positive experience and not just a hurdle.
So I think when we think of academic publishing, everyone thinks first and foremost of a journal article. But another format that students often have questions about, I think, is book reviews. Should you publish book reviews in graduate school? And if not, when should you start publishing book reviews? Personally, I've received conflicting advice on that. I was actually advised even late in my undergraduate times in Belgium that I should publish book reviews, and so I did. I actually got books from my advisor that he said, okay, I don't want to review this. Can you please review this, because it's going to help you as well to make an intervention, get some kind of public exposure. But then when I came here, people were saying, oh no, absolutely no book reviews. It might harm your reputation. It might you might antagonize people who you will need later when you are applying for jobs or when you are going for tenure reviews. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that question.
I can just say from an administrative point of view that at AJS we do a lot of book reviews, a couple hundred a year. And although we have seen a weakening of this line through the years because of the availability of qualified reviewers to do book reviews, we really do avoid asking graduate students to review books, primarily because it's hard to see into the future if you're reviewing a book for someone, of someone who you might meet on the job path. It could be wonderful. This person could say, oh, you reviewed my book, you just got it, I love you, I'm on your side. But there can also be another way, a way that it could go. So I think we tend to tread lightly on that idea of graduate students and book reviews. And then the other thing I would say as a publishing person strictly is that I think there is a little bit of hesitancy on the part of publishers to see book reviews written by academic hopefuls who have not yet themselves published a book. So that's maybe a different arena, but books should be taken seriously by the peers of the author, and they should be, ideally, in a wonderful and ideal world, they would be reviewed by those peers. And that's the administrative viewpoint. So,
yeah, we at the JMH we don't invite graduate students to review books, and I think because of this idea that one should have published a book before one reviews a book. I had actually never thought about the problem of graduate students reviewing books, but when I think about it, it seems that there's probably more peril than there's payoff in it. The peril for the reasons that have been spelled out, but I don't think there's as much payoff for you in terms of getting yourself out there, as we now say, as a reviewer of books as there is as an author of your own work. So I think I would generally advise against it. I don't know whether you
I would say in at least, my work tends to be fairly technical, and so consequently I deal with other technical social science fields and some social science, some aspects of other fields that can be brought into social science. So in some of the fields that I deal with, in psychology, in economics, and statistics, you would never, ever be writing a book review yourself because it's unlikely that the review would be written by somebody who hasn't already contributed to that discipline, who hasn't already said something in some meaningful form. In fact, it's really unlikely that you would be even writing a book in the first place unless you had already established some kind of a track record in the form of articles and some other kind of maybe very, very well known circulated semi-articles, such as the ones that might appear on PLOS One or other open source type circulation venues. It's so I would say it'd be extremely unusual. In political science, I would say that there are some occasions when graduate students get asked to write book reviews, but I would not personally be encouraging our graduate students to be doing that.
Looks like we have a fair amount of consensus on this topic, and maybe with that we can move on to the second aspect, finding the right journal. So on the registration page for this workshop, I asked people what they would like to hear something about today, and I think the number one question that came up is, okay, I have something, I would like to publish it, but how do I find the right journal? And by the right journal, I think we can mean a couple of things. The most prestigious journal that will accept my submission, or a journal that is most likely to increase my impact, or both of those. So how do you go about that process?
Well, I guess, you probably don't send your first article to the highest ranking journals, because those are the hardest to get accepted in, and they also take a very long time usually to give responses. So if you're in the position of wanting to get a publication before you go on the job market, you probably choose a sort of middle rung journal that is, something that is prestigious but more specialized. I mean, the journals that are more general, journals like the AJS or the JMH or the AHR, have a huge number of people eligible to submit articles. So you want to choose something that is more specialized for your field because they have a smaller number of possible people submitting the article, and they're likely to give you a much better turnaround time, and they're also more likely to send it out. I mean, it seems to me what you want to avoid is a situation of sending out articles where they're judged too far from the profile of the journal, that they're not even regarded as something that the editors ought to send out. You want to cross that hurdle of getting it sent out so that you can get peer review feedback. So the best journals do have articles in them that are by graduate students. Graduate students do get published in the JMH and the AJR, and I see Susan nodding. The AJS, the AHR publishes graduate student work. So the question is, I think, one of timing, whether you feel you have the time to send it out to the top rung journals, or you think that it's really, you know, good enough, important enough, significant enough for those. But if you have a kind of practical problem of, I'd like to get something on my CV before I go on the job market, I'd advise starting first with a middle rung journal.
I'd say that in political science, that the answer would be different than it would be in perhaps other fields. In political science, some of the very top journals, and in our field we really have three. We have the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, and the Journal of Politics. And depending on the editorial boards, depending on the years that they are running these, sometimes they can take, from the moment of submission through the final publication, up to 3 years before you eventually see that. And if you are hoping to get through your graduate program sometime, before a decade is out, that might not be the optimal place to be sending it. So you do want to know where the turnaround time is. I can also say that some of the subfield journals have also got that terrible long delay cycle to them. Maybe not so many of them, perhaps. But I know of at least one specializing in elections where it's at least 3 years before between submission and when it finally comes through. Some of the very best journals have the fastest turnaround. The American Journal of Political Science has typically got somewhere along the order of a month to 6 weeks before they will send an article back to you. The political analysis, the top journal in methodological work in my field, is equivalently speedy. Journal of Politics and APSR, the other two top flagship journals on our field, are fairly long. And all those, depends on the editor, it depends on the configuration of referees that have been brought in. Your cycle between submission and eventual publication could be anywhere from on the order of a year. That's quite good. Maybe 3 months before it's been accepted, through 3 years. It really can be, particularly for a person who's just wanting to get started off in your career, not all that helpful. So, that's focusing on the more material side of things. How do we get things out so it gets people to see my work because it's out there, because it's in print? Another question is, how do you find the right journal in which to send this material? And for that, you've got to be reading the journal. You really, really do not want to be sending your material to a journal where you've never read an article from that journal before. We have, I've certainly seen colleagues who've gone through this process of going, gee, who else might publish this thing that I've written and has been rejected from, a journal ABC. Does Journal X publish this? I've never heard of Journal X. Might they be interested in this kind of work? And you begin to ask around and you find out some things about Journal X, and perhaps Journal X is a good source, but you've never read it. So you don't know what the other people in that journal are thinking as being important. You don't know what the debates are that the readers at that journal are standing out as or identifying as being critical for you to be engaged in. And it's silly for you to be wasting your time, even if it's only a matter of a month, waiting for feedback from a journal where you know that it's not really all that relevant. So read the journals that you're going to be sending material to before you even think about sending your own submission to that journal. You want to know, is this the sort of thing that journal's likely to accept? It also will provide you perhaps with some guidance as to the kind of thing that they would be looking for. Are they looking for a more discursive presentation of the ideas and the development of the theory behind it? Or are they looking for a very quick set of presentations, assuming you know exactly what the debate is about, and identifying a specific research question very rapidly? Our journals in political science are of all varieties, including those that prefer that you go on and on, not my preference, as you might gather, to those that really are just snap to the point and assume that you are as familiar with this debate as any other reader of that journal would be familiar with.
I would just like to say that at HAS, things are slightly different in that we have a reputation for reviewing everything.
Oh, really?
Yes, we
Oh,
do.
my
And the
goodness.
problem is now,
That's
over the
impressive.
last few years, we've gone from 400 submissions a year to 600 submissions a year. And what that has caused is a new thinking about reviewing everything.
Yeah.
So we now desk reject about 20% of the papers that we receive. I think when I started at AJS in the late, like 1990, we would reject 8 or 9 papers a year written by people who wanted to talk about people using a microwave to send their thoughts elsewhere. But now we're open to a new universe of naive submission, which is a big burden for the journals. And we do get a lot of very, very early papers that strike most of our editors as being a little bit premature for peer review in AJS. But we do review a lot of papers. And part of the reason we do that is that in sociology, the specialized journals tend to be very particular about what they review.
Uh-huh.
And I think that the analogy here for sociology journals is that publishing in a journal is like participating in a community. And if you're a member of that community, then that journal is right for you. But if you're just shopping for a title behind which to put your paper, you're likely to have a tough time even getting reviewed by a specialized journal. So AJS and ASR, the other big general journal, do tend to review a lot of papers that they know are not going to be published in their pages, but they do it because the journals view themselves as required to offer some kind of exposure to what you're talking about, which is a lot of people don't have access to the kind of feedback that you can get from a very good review process. So we spend a lot of time trying to provide a very thorough and thoughtful review process to people whose papers go out for review. And one of the things about picking a journal, I would say, is what are you citing? To whom are you speaking? So if you send a paper to AJS that's 2/3 theory and society citations, hello, maybe you should be sending this to theory and society. You know, so think about that community you already belong to, those people who are already speaking your language and doing the kind of work that you're doing. That as a smaller, more specialized journal would be a good place to think about submitting.
I should say, too, that the peer review process is the kind of uncertain element in all of these submissions because you never know how much time it's going to take. You know, you can, we usually at the JMH, we send articles out to at least 2 people, sometimes 3, and you have people in mind often, and you send them invitations, and you wait, and they don't reply, and then someone replies and says that her mother is ill and she can't get it in on time, but will get it in later. And so you just never know when these reviews are going to come in. And then if it's a second review process, if you get a revise and resubmit, the same thing obtains, that we just never know how efficient the outside reviewers are going to be. And often papers that we feel very badly about because they've just taken so long to get through the review process, it's just been a matter of reviewers not being able to do them on time. So that's something that you can never, it's just one of those uncontrollable parts of the procedure. It happens to be probably the most important part of it, but you just can't be sure that it's going to be carried out on time.
So Susan, you mentioned that you receive about 600 submissions a year. I was wondering if you could maybe give us a sense of what percentage of that is rejected outright, what percentage would be accepted with revisions and then without revisions? I think that might be helpful too.
Of those 600 papers, 20% is our desk reject rate right now. But those tend to be papers that are quite unfamiliar to us. So we look at them and we say, oh, here's an economist who wants to tell people who read AJS why American educational policy is messed up. But that's not a conversation anybody wants to have in AJS. I mean, it's just, there's no point in reviewing it. We don't even have reviewers who want to read it. So we just say, you should send this to an economics journal. And then we get a lot of third world type submissions of people. We try to redirect them to places where they really can get some kind of feedback. But we can't provide it because our reviewers get very mad if we send them materials that are not plausible research projects that have some merit to the writing. They don't have to be AJS quality submissions or AJS ready submissions, but they have to be written by people who are seriously in the game, who are pursuing with passion their area of study. So what gets published without revision in AJS? Nothing. There's just nothing.
I can think of one article that we accepted without revision. People wrote, "This is a perfect article. I have nothing to say about it." You know, publish it. But that is very, very rare.
Mm-hmm.
You send out an article to a bunch of academics, they all have something to say about how to improve it. So,
And so, in thinking about preparing an article for publication, most articles, I think, start their life as something else. They start as a course paper, a conference paper, part of a dissertation, sometimes even as a footnote, as a side project that came out of something else. But as we all know, a journal article is a genre with its own conventions. And as John mentioned, those conventions might even differ from journal to journal, even within the same field. Some journals might prefer sort of more context, more introductory materials. Other journals want you to come straight to the point. So I was wondering if you could think a little bit about how to frame your submission as an article and how to adapt it to those generic conventions. So how do you make something that initially wasn't an article look and feel like an article?
I'd say that it's very unlikely that the person that you submitted this article to, in the case particularly of a seminar, perhaps also immediately to your dissertation advisor, or the other extreme, is the person that you want to be reading the paper for immediate advice about how to send it out to the next journal. Because the two of you have just been communicating so much on the same wavelength that you know exactly what the codes are. You know exactly what the conversations have been about in the course or in the process of developing the paper, that you need to get somebody who's going to be presenting or providing for you an alternative mind, an alternative interpretation of your communications, your attempt to try to reach this audience that you believe that you need to reach. So for that, I would look towards probably not your peers, but your peers are not people you would want to immediately rule out. I'd want probably to find other faculty members who are maybe not immediately connected with your dissertation, or are not maybe other members of your committee who are not your immediate dissertation advisor, or maybe not the person who would have been responsible for the course, and particularly in the case of a seminar paper that's to be going out. If it's a chapter of your dissertation, well, you really have to have somebody outside of the dissertation committee taking a look at what you've done before you'll have a sense of is somebody outside of the people for whom we've got the same set of Legos, we're building the same set of argument together, that you need to start communicating with in maybe a completely different metaphor about how the building of this project would go.
I think as working with graduate students in the one-on-one sessions, I've worked with several people trying to turn something else into an article, and usually the place where I start with them is some of the things that you've all already mentioned, which is understanding the content of the conversations, and also understanding the sort of function of the different parts of the articles in the journals that they would like to submit. So thinking about those two things, and then looking at the piece that they've written to try to figure out where their intervention takes place. How do they intervene in a conversation that's already happening and then formulate it in a way that that journal will decide is, yes, this is how we talk about these things in this reading community.
I think too that chapters of a dissertation, that is writing going somewhere in particular. So each chapter builds to a particular place. And you have to recognize if you take a chapter out of your dissertation and you're going to present it as an article, it may not have a couple of really important things that are necessary. First, an articulable problem or puzzle. There has to be something that this piece is about, that is contained within this article itself. And the second thing is, you always have to think about the so what question. Why should people care about that puzzle? Because you have to set it up as an interesting problem to engage the reader, insofar as academic writing does engage the reader. I mean, that's so important. So those two things are things you should think about. Where is the puzzle or the problem that is in this particular thing that I was using for something else, and now I can create that puzzle or problem, and this thing I've already written will serve as the revisable place to start. And why should people care about it? That's truly very important. And intervention is a great word. We tell people that a lot at AJS. We're looking for papers that make a decisive intervention in a long-standing sociological topic. Decisive. So you may not be able to say something totally new, but maybe you can say something completely decisive.
I would say too that we just adopted the requirement of having abstracts of papers, which I think most journals have had for some time. But I think it's a very good test of whether you have that kind of argument and that decisive intervention when you sit down to write the abstract, and whether you find it a very painful process that you really cannot do easily, or whether you can do it easily. You should be able to write an abstract that sums up what the argument and the nature of that intervention is. So that's a good testing space, I think.
It shouldn't be painless, though. I mean, there should be some pain that's involved.
There should always be pain throughout the whole process. That's why we're academics, right?
Well, in particular, in preparing the abstract and forcing yourself to think about how do I present in the 100, 200,
Yeah.
or how long your abstracts tend to run, but to present in a cogent form a sufficient summary of the argument that somebody would want to actually read the article.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have two different styles of dissertations that are prepared in our field. I'd say that about half of those that I see currently are monographs. They really are of these forms that you're intended to build from an argument from. Well, I've set the case up early, and this is the next step in the case, and this is the next step of the case, and this is the third, and third follows from second, follows from first. It's obviously a sequential construction of an argument. The other half of the dissertations are quite common in economics. They're almost required in economics. They're almost required in psychology, would be the article format dissertation. The three articles that, in some aspects, we used to joke, are bound together only by their staple, or bound together only by the thread that connects the binding for the argument. That's obviously an exaggeration. There's some common unity about what's being developed here. And for those, it's an easier job to think about how to identify what it is. Perhaps the harder challenge is going to be to think about how you unify all of these elements to convince your dissertation committee that you've actually got a dissertation that you could then move forward on to the next job. But the extracting the article out of the three-article dissertation is less immediately of a challenge.
So I received a question from the audience to which there might not be an easy answer, but I'd still be curious to hear your thoughts about it. Someone asked, how do you know when your paper is ready to send off? Because I think we're all familiar with the phenomenon of endless revising and feeling there's always something we can still change, and always something we can do to anticipate our peer reviewers' comments. So how do you know your article is ready to send off, maybe from your own experience?
I'd say it's when the questions start changing. So you should always be bringing these articles out to an audience to read. whether it's at a workshop format or whether it's at a conference or simply sending it out to somebody else. And when the questions come initially back to you, and they'll be of the form, well, you should do this, or there's suggestions about other modifications. And then they eventually will start changing to things like, well, what does this mean if I were to think about, and sort of encouraging you to think about the substitution of the argument into a different extension or a different argument to, ideally. So when is this thing coming out again? Or where is it coming out? And then you certainly should know it's really long past time to send this thing out for somebody else to be considering.
Yeah, I think I think people tend to know when it's done. I mean, when they've done as much as they can do at this point. You don't want to send out something that is too perfect, in a sense, because your reviewers are always going to find things that they would like to modify. You most certainly don't want to send out a paper, and I have seen these, where you're kind of turning to the peer reviewers to give you ideas about how to turn it into a cogent paper. But I think, when you feel that you've come to the point that you really don't know what else to add here, and other people agree with you about that, it's a good time to send it off.
So I think in an ideal world, we would all like to get our papers back with comments from the two peer reviewers that either overlap, or with the two peer reviewers just saying, this is great, just go ahead and send it in. Unfortunately, that's rarely how it happens, and often two peer reviewers will say things that even contradict each other.
Oh, yes.
Or they will have requirements with which you disagree, or that make you think, did this person even read my paper? Did they interpret my argument correctly? So you want to push back, but of course, the fate of your article is going to depend on your peer reviewers. So I was wondering if you could maybe say something about that challenge of dealing with that criticism and turning it into revisions without getting stuck.
I would say that the editors ought to be helping you with that. I mean, when we get back reports that are contradictory with each other, I don't just send them back to the reader and say, could you prepare a version of this that responds to the reader's comments? Because obviously there's no way to do that. And so I think at that point, editors should and usually do say, we think the most important line of argument is thus and so, and that you do not need to reply to what reader number 2 said about thus and so. Or, every now and then you get a reader who is allergic to the paper. I mean, just, I can think of reviews that end, please do not publish. And, you say, reader number 1 is allergic to the paper. The editors do not agree with reader number 1's assumptions. Concentrate on 2 and 3. So I think, in an ideal world, your editor will help you navigate that. But maybe that's not always the case.
But that's not the AJS world.
Okay, that's JMH world.
But I think part of this comes down to the culture of a particular publication.
Yeah.
So what happens at AJS is on a first submission, you get 3 reviews. And then if you are invited to revise, you're going to get 2 reviews. You're going to get somebody from the first round, one of those 3 people, and then you're going to get a new reviewer.
Oh, you do it so differently.
Yes. And a lot of people get mad and say, why was there a new reviewer?
Yes.
But the problem is that a lot of people, when they've read a paper before, and then they read it the second time, they go, well, okay. So, or that particular person that's reading it for the second time isn't someone who's in a position to see something that crept into the paper that's truly an error. There's something that really is a problem. So somebody with a different perspective might say, hey, wait a second, I just noticed that there are a lot of R-square jokes around the table at AJS that I don't get because I'm not a sociologist. I was trained as a musician. Saves me a lot of anxiety in my job, too. Kind of outside. But so what we do is a little bit different. We send back the decision letter and the reviews to the reviewers. So you have to be extremely careful how you characterize the reviews, because the reviewer is going to see what you say about their review. So you get a little less guidance in that situation. And so what we'll tend to say is something like, all of the reviewers are clearly engaged by the paper, you should read their comments carefully. We think that Reviewer C provides probably the strongest outline for the strongest direction for the paper in revision. But read them all with care. So we try to give a clue, but we really do count upon the author of the paper to have a committed idea about what the paper is supposed to do, because it is your project. And we also ask you to write a revision memo when you return the paper. Do you do this at JMH?
Sometimes.
Okay.
Sometimes our procedures are more fluid than yours, I think.
Well, we're not very fluid. But what can happen in the revision memo is it provides an opportunity for the author to engage with the hostile reviewer and say things like, I really appreciated your suggestion about a completely new data set. But this is why I chose this data, and at least for this project, I'm going to stick with it, but I'm going to have my eye out for something down the road, more in line with what you're talking about. I mean, it's a place where you can make a statement about the paper that's not in the paper itself. Because the conversation that you may wish to have with reviewers as a revising author is probably not a conversation that anyone wants to publish in a journal. So, you have to be a little bit sensitive, and John was saying, you're presenting your paper, you should be reading the paper, people should be reading your paper. I think there's something that we talk about at AJS, and that is letting other people read your reviews.
Yes.
And talk to you. Sometimes you'll read something that somebody says about your paper and it just pushes your button, and you just are so upset or angry, or you feel so devaluated. But someone else can read the same comments and go, no, that's not what they're saying. They're really talking about this other thing. So don't hide your light under a bushel basket.
Yeah.
Be part of a scholarly community and be brave and share the input that you get. So if it's hurtful or seems wrong direction, you can get somebody else's perspective on that. It can be so useful, so helpful.
Here, I would say that's an excellent idea. Because you're so personally involved in that paper that every negative comment about it wounds you to the core, and it really is important to get outside, the outside sense of what those readers are saying. I mean, and sometimes they are mean.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's also a possibility. So,
and that's a difficult situation because
yeah, it is.
When you have anonymous reviewers and anonymous paper authors, it creates an even stronger barrier against censorship. We don't feel that we can censor the comments of the reviewers.
Yes.
Because we've invited them into this process. And so their reaction is their reaction. Now there's certain language, bad language, or personally insulting things that we will ask the reviewer if we can change.
Yes, we do that too.
Yeah.
If it seems to be hurtful.
Yeah, some people just aren't very good at interpersonal things, and it shows up in their reviews. So we try to monitor that.
So we've already touched on some of this, but I wanted to end maybe as the last question before we open the floor to questions from the audience. With a question, where can you go to when you get stuck at any of these phases in the publishing process? I think most of us will probably think first and foremost of our advisor. But I was wondering if you could say maybe a little bit about what resources are available here on campus and what resources you should turn to. So some of you mentioned already that don't sort of do this all on your own, be part of the conversation. So I was wondering if you could maybe close on that note. What if you do get stuck at any point, what resources should you turn to it?
I can speak to that quite a bit. We
that's right.
provide a lot of
Resources.
for graduate students who are writing. We have a full quarter class that you may choose to take where you'll be doing weekly writing and working in a group of 7 students from maybe your own discipline, maybe a different discipline. We have Larry McInerney and I are doing standalone workshops. We're doing the third series this quarter, also part of the Graduate Student Affairs Graduate Writing Initiative. And all of these have been on constructing value, which very much speaks to the issues with publishing in a journal. A lot of people who've been taking the sessions have been thinking about that. And also the one-on-one sessions with graduate writing consultants. You can only book one appointment at a time, but you can, after you have your appointment, you can book another one and then another one and work on revising what you're writing. We do ask you that you bring a piece of writing, whether it is your own or a piece of writing from the field that you want to look at more carefully. We're not going to help you read it for content, but we will help you think about rhetorical choices that the writer has made. But you can also bring very roughly drafted material. The sessions often end up being a lot of sort of talking and writing, and it's meant to be collaborative, so we give you as writers a lot of time to talk through your own argument, and people have given us positive feedback about those things as a resource in addition to talking with their advisor. Sometimes we are a little bit less scary than your advisors, although maybe not.
Yeah, I guess I mean, often I think you can tell from the reviews whether it is a sort of rhetorical problem that you have, a problem of presenting your case, presenting your evidence, in which case, obviously, to go to the writing program would be extremely helpful. Other problems may have to do with the evidence itself, and the writing program can't help with that. I mean, that's something that you need to talk to professors about, or other friends that are in the field.
And for help on the evidence, my role in my department happens to be, I'm one of the more teched up, I'm actually probably currently the most teched up guy in the department, so I handle almost all of the methods, classes, the program itself, and I have people who are bringing their papers who've been rejected from a journal, bring it up to me and says, now they say, I need to learn this technique, and I'm going, oh my goodness, you should have taken about 3 of my classes. And at that point, the honest answer is going to be, you really should have been taking 3 of my classes. It's not going to be, I'm going to tell you in the next 10 minutes what you need to do in order to appease this reviewer, because at best what you're going to do is to come up with an argument that is going to be on the flimsiest of foundations, and it's going to be just shot down by the next graduate student who's looking to find an easy publication based on a flaw that you've done in your work. And he would have taken maybe not my 3 classes, but the 3 classes that would have been offered by somebody else somewhere else. I mean, there are smaller leaps to make, and you need to know about, say, maybe related versions of a maximum likelihood approach, and they're saying, well, that's not quite the right approach. What you need to do is to take this modification, for example, in which you want to know about where is that modification, and you might be able to get some advice about how to move from your training over to training that you might easily incorporate. But if the training is so far outside of what you're doing, either you can't respond to that and you need to go to a different journal, or you need to invest a lot more of your time before you even think whether you want to submit this another try, probably to another place.
Or you might know someone, a colleague, graduate student colleague, that is up to snuff on these techniques, who would be willing to look at what you've done and talk to you about those reviews, and perhaps if the technical issue is a big enough issue, you could have a co-authored paper with someone who understands how to defend your idea against people. I used to think that mathematics was right on and secure, and there was only one right answer, and sitting in AJS all these years, I've discovered it's a field of nuance and mystery, just like so many others. And so sometimes it takes a person who really understands that method to work with you and to be a co-author with you and help you find the way to defend what you're doing. Now, you know, there's this whole issue about sole-authored papers versus co-authored papers versus group-authored papers, and maybe this particular paper is not a paper that you can share with another person, because too much of what you want to do in terms of the job market has to be this sole-authored paper. So it's not a silver bullet to find somebody to work with. But that is something that sometimes can be a productive way out of a problem like that. If you can't retool yourself methodologically, you might marry yourself temporarily to somebody with some really great quantoid views.
With that, I would like to open the floor to questions, but not before first thanking our panelists. Questions?
I have questions. So we talk a lot in Emerging Leaders about a variety of career paths that people might take, not just in academia. I was wondering if you could speak to whether there are ever submissions, whether there are ever publications from people in academic journals who are now themselves slightly outside, possibly outside of academia, or if all publications tend to come from graduate students or professors.
I could only speak for HAS, and it's a 100% academic-driven enterprise.
I'd say the same thing about JMH.
I'd say that it, in political science or in other aspects of particularly quantitative social science, there may be, the equivalent of a Bell Labs, you know, a group of people who are really acquired a dedicated set of skills, who are in industry or affiliated with industry, or potentially affiliated with government, who may actually have been one-time academics themselves. They probably acquired their training somewhere through the process of academics. Maybe they have some beliefs that they will return to academics themselves. But those would be the exceptions of the sorts of things that I would be seeing.
Yeah.
A question. Given that it's almost May, would you say it's foolish to try and submit something and getting an R&R for the fall market season at this point?
No. I think you should try that if you've got a piece that seems ready to go. I mean, it's really the luck of the draw. I mean, I can think of a good friend of mine who sent a piece into the JMH, and she happened to have sent it in just before our editorial meeting, so we agreed to send it out. Everyone immediately accepted the invitation to review it and wrote their reports on time, and it was, you know, very, very swift. So you really can't tell what's going to happen, and I think you should do that.
As a follow-up, so you don't think there's any drop-off in the summer?
Oh,
No.
drop off in the summer. No, I mean, in fact, we continue to do our work, and at the end of every summer, we get enormous amounts of submissions because everyone's been working on their articles over the summer. But no. There isn't any problem about the summer coming. Absolutely
At
not.
HAS, the summer can be the busiest time because so many people who are busy with coursework, with teaching and grading and being on committees. Summer is when they create time to finish something up and get it off to us. And also reviewer time tends to be a little bit better in the summer. And this is something that's really changed with electronic communication. Back in the olden days when we used mail, we would mail manuscripts to a department and somebody would be in Maine for the summer.
Right.
That didn't do very well for turnaround time. But now we email people
we don't
with
know
a paper
where they
and
are.
they get it if they're in Istanbul. It doesn't
That's
matter.
right.
So that part works much better now.
Let me put it this way. As the person who's, say, likely to be looking at, I don't know, maybe somewhere around 6 to 10 requests to review an article, just as I'm finishing up my class, I'm going, God, no. I don't want to see this. If I'm really interested in it, I'll take a look at it. So if I see an article that's been submitted in May, I'm much more likely to be interested in it than if I'm, say, in the middle of vacation. I received personally, an atheist, in particular, connection to particular religious holidays doesn't mean anything to me. But when an editor from one of our top journals sends me an article to review at 10 o'clock Christmas Eve, I'm thinking, what is wrong with you? I'm not going to review this, and I refuse. Just a matter of principle, I just sent it back to him just because he's just completely insensitive to what the editor, the reviewers of this process are going to be like. So I would say if you're looking at a choice between getting your article out in May versus getting your article out in June, get it out in May. If you're getting your article out in June, that's probably better than July. If it's in July, the reviewers are going to be on vacation.
Thanks. Are there any rules about submitting an article simultaneously to multiple journals?
Yes.
Oh, don't
You
ever
can
do that.
do it.
No.
You can now do that with books, which is really great. But journal articles, absolutely not. So you have to kind of pick and choose and decide.
The problem is that the reviewer resources get used up very quickly, and then we're using our resources on a paper that's not, in fact,
Eligible.
yeah, because if the other journal finishes their review process first, you're going to write to us and say, hey, guess what? My paper's being published by somebody else, and then we're standing there holding some reviews. So we're very clear about that on the submissions page. Don't do it.
I was wondering, what are the rules for publishing things that have been published in a different language?
Yeah, we have thought a lot about this at the JMH, and the rule is that, let's say it's a paper about France and you've published it in French. Then the feeling is we don't want to publish it because everybody who has a major interest in it is going to be able to read it anyway. If it's a paper about France and you've published it in Turkish, then we will consider it. So it has to do with the accessibility of the foreign language to the people most likely to be interested in the paper.
I think in 121 years of AJS, there have been 2 papers that have been published as translations from another language, and they were both unusual circumstances. So one was a paper originally published in German by someone who was an important sociologist, and it was just kind of a stray piece that had never been translated. I don't know the circumstances of the other one because I didn't work at AJS then. It's just so hard to know what the overlap really is when you're dealing with a translation, and the demand for the pages is so high at AJS that we just would rather not go into that.
Is there, so you're, particularly for graduate students, is there anything else whatsoever that's like the consideration in publishing something, or is it literally 100%? I'm thinking of like CDs or things that you might submit with your article. Is it literally 100% just what's on, like the quality of what's on the page?
That's it.
That's it. I would also, I mean, sometimes graduate students try to hide the fact that they're graduate students. I would not advise that. Say, in the cover letter, this is a piece of my dissertation. I am, currently getting my PhD from so-and-so.
I think there's one thing that I wanted to say about the abstracts when people were talking about abstracts. Most of the people that run the peer review process and the people at AJS who sit around the table and look at all the papers and assign all the reviewers, a really well-written abstract is the most powerful tool you have for getting good reviewers.
Yeah, it's true.
Because the first encounter of the editor with the paper is the abstract. So you've got an interesting puzzle or question, you're clear about what the data are that you're using. You hint a little bit about what you're going to find, and you tell everyone why it's important to know this. You put that in an abstract, and then the person who reads it says, "Hey, this sounds promising." And
I'd like to
you,
read
yeah,
this.
you move
Send it
right
along.
up. Because, you know, there are degrees of reviewers. It's just the truth. The more promising the paper, probably the better, the more thoughtful, the people with the reputation for writing thoughtful, thorough reviews get the more promising papers. It's just how the system has to work. So write a really good abstract, and Linda can help you do that.
Yeah.
I'm dealing with a little bit of a different beast. I'm an undergraduate working with the Chicago Journal of Sociology, which is a new undergraduate journal. And I was wondering, with regard to this kind of project, which is less about, perhaps less about, you know, having a career in academia, and perhaps more about having potential writing samples for graduate or professional school, or even just merely sharing research among the undergraduate community. To sort of build up a new organization, what does it take for a journal to build some sort of legitimacy, or I guess some sort of incentive for individuals to want to be part of it?
Does the Chicago Journal of Sociology distribute its table of contents, or distribute other advertisements to other departments so that other professors would know of this or the like, so they would think that this is a place that my undergraduates ought to be paying attention to, even if I don't know if the Chicago Journal of Sociology is accepting submissions from non-University of Chicago students. Many of them don't. But that they would at least see that this is the format, these are the expectations, this is the style that people at this university do for the quality of their work. I think that would be a really valuable thing to be doing.
Any other questions?
I'm a student of history, and I was wondering, when you send an article, how often do the reviewers say that you haven't done enough of archival work? There's something that the author doesn't know about, or are talking about the questions of evidence, you know. So is it kind of a usual thing, or is it just a question of how you have argued your case with the paper?
I think that depends on the particular reviewer. Certain reviewers are real archive rats, and they, even if they like the paper, they will mention various ways that it could be enhanced archivally. But I have never seen a review say, you know, the argument is well made but could have been made better, and so, you know, if they went back to the archive. So I think just so long as you have enough archival evidence to make your case in that kind of intuitive way that historians reason about such things, you're not going to be held to account for not having looked at every source possible. You know, the people who fall under the archive rat category are going to suggest this in a friendly way, except if they do not find that the evidence that you do adduce supports your claims.
We have room for one last question. Okay, yeah.
This is tangentially related, but when you are submitting articles, is there at all, does it ever enter the conversation if a dissertation has been put out for open source, open access? Is this something graduate students are
Yeah.
concerned about? Is this something that comes into the conversation? Does this affect people's ability to publish after they've?
Yeah, one of the things we've done at the JMH now is to say if we accept if we agree to send your article out for publication and it's currently online, we would like you to take it down during the process. And that's because we have found reviewers can find the piece online. And hence the anonymity of the peer review process breaks down. And so that has been our concern, which is a different question, I guess, from whether a book publisher is going to be interested in your book if it has appeared online as a
But even
dis-
if, so if you're writing, an article based on a chapter for dissertation, that's not something that you, it hadn't fully occurred to me that the anonymity would be the problem, but it's not that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of cases where we've sent something out for review and the reviewer will write back, I found this online. Which probably wouldn't be the case with an article that came from a dissertation anyway.
Yeah.
Because there wouldn't be any way to trace it in that way. But if an author sends in a piece that has the same title as the piece online. Yeah.
We have some struggles in this area with something called SSRN. I don't know if people here are familiar with that. So things will be posted on Social Science Research Network, and as long as they haven't signed a publication agreement, a common, Creative Commons agreement, then we will review the paper. But if we accept the paper, then the author has to agree to remove it from SSRN because it's a competitive posting of the material. So if you have your own website and you have an AJS article, you're welcome to put up a PDF of your AJS article on your website or on your university's website.
Yeah.
But the systematic presentation, indexing, and et cetera of articles for the purpose of creating an interesting website that draws people to read, that's just publishing. So we if you've published it on SSRN, then it's published. That's kind of one of the things we think.
Say for our field that the anonymity is really more by the agreement of the reviewer not to go actively searching for the paper. Just because almost all of the papers that would be coming out to us for review would have appeared it had been submitted to one of our major conferences and typically are available already in an electronic form in their conference archives, and maybe it's been lifted directly out of it, and you've got the name and attribution and all of the credits directly on it. So. I mean, you could find it probably if you felt like looking. So who really wrote this particular essay? And it's fairly trivial to locate it. Google with putting quotes around the title will generally bring it straight up. Sort of dishonorable to do that, but that doesn't stop, I suppose, anybody who doesn't feel so bound.
I think the real value of double-blind review is it allows everyone to shed their obligations to the persons. So if I get a paper and I think that's your paper, but it doesn't have your name on it, and I think I can say something useful and objective about it, I go ahead and review it. I don't have to take you as a person into account. I can just look at that paper and react to that paper. Because you're right, everyone could know what everyone is writing if they so chose to do.
We often get questions from reviewers or potential reviewers. I know the author of that paper from the title and the abstract. Am I eligible to review it anyway? And then we say it's up to you. Consult your conscience. Can you? Do you believe you can review it fairly? And people generally say yes, and sometimes people don't want to do it. So.
Any questions? Okay, since it's nearly 2:50, I think we will probably have to wrap up here then. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to our panelists.